I felt my jaw tighten the moment I saw the glossy sign, Avery Peak Relaxation Retreat. Opening soon. It was staked in the dirt on what was indisputably my property. I hadn't driven up that old mountain road in over a year, mostly because the terrain was so rough it took a true off-roader to make the journey. Yet here was a luxurious board plastered with images of spa treatments, hot tubs, and fancy chalets. And behind the sign stretched a jaw-dropping network of partially built cabins, fresh gravel roads, and a monstrous skeleton of a main lodge. Was this some kind of elaborate hoax? Maybe an extravagant film set? Or had I driven into a parallel universe? I switched off my truck's engine and stepped out onto the rocky clearing for a better look. My heart pounded with a furious mix of disbelief, curiosity, and a trickle of rage. I'd inherited this land after my father passed away 10 years ago, a modest chunk of wild acreage known to the locals as the Avery Peak property. It wasn't on the official tourist maps because of the difficult roads, but folks who'd lived in the valley long enough remembered it for the thick pine forests and the pristine waterfall tucked deep inside. To me, it was always a place I'd come to escape life's demands. In my youth, Dad would bring me up here for weekend camping trips, teaching me how to fish, how to track deer without disturbing them, and how to respect the land's quiet secrets. Over time, the property had become more of a memory than a destination. The very nature of it, harsh winter storms, rocky inclines, kept me from visiting regularly. But I still felt a fierce fondness for every boulder, every pine. I was the rightful owner, no doubt about that. But now I was facing something so surreal I had to pinch my arm just to check if I was awake. A resort development? In the middle of my land? I walked around for a good hour, passing rows of log cabins in various stages of completion. Workers had placed solar lights along newly paved walkways. There was even a brand new well pump station with a red property sign half-labeled Cedar Springs, which must be the name of their precious new spa water. Anger roiled in my gut, but a deeper question pressed on me like a weight. How in the world did the local homeowners association, an entity infamous around these parts for pushing boundaries, believe they had any right to build here? The Avery Peak property didn't fall under their jurisdiction. The boundary lines had always been set in stone, going back to the 19th century. I should have known something was off when I got the invitation in the mail a few months ago. An ominously cheerful flyer from the High Creeks HOA announcing that a new partnership was in place to create exclusive luxury mountain living experiences. I'd shrugged it off at the time, figuring it was just one of those marketing schemes. I never realized they'd do something this huge. The next morning, I made a beeline to the downtown planning office. I slapped the resort's flyer on the receptionist's desk and demanded to speak to whichever official had the gall to approve that project. My stare must have been intimidating enough to get me a face-to-face with the county clerk within minutes. The clerk was a kind, older woman who seemed as confused by the situation as I was. "Yes, I see the new building permits in the system," she said, tapping her red nails on the computer keyboard. "All filed by the High Creeks Homeowners Association. They claim full rights to the land." "My land," I retorted, heartbeat pounding in my temples. "Are there any records to dispute that? Because I have the deed. I got all the paperwork showing it was passed down from my father." She pulled up records, scanned them with furrowed brows, and shook her head. "Well, they have a separate file here stating the Avery Peak acreage was rolled into the HOA's master plan a couple of years ago. Oddly enough, it's noted as a voluntary annexation." I fought the urge to laugh. Voluntary? I never consented to that. The clerk looked up at me sympathetically. "Mr. Avery, this is all the signs of some land confusion. Possibly a forged signature or a slipshod notary. But let me be honest, High Creeks can be slippery. They have deep pockets. Trust me, I know. But this is beyond the pale. This was an entire building operation. How could they get so far so fast?" She shrugged. "Their attorney is tenacious, and the county planning board is often swayed by big promises of economic growth. A new resort means more jobs, tax revenue. Politicians practically beg for that." I left the office with a bitter taste in my mouth, my mind teeming with half-formed ideas. On the drive back home, I tried to figure out a strategy. Lawsuits? Injunctions? The HOA had plenty of money, so they'd probably drag the case out in courts for years. Meanwhile, they'd finish building the resort, start turning a profit, and eventually overwhelm me. Still, I wasn't about to let it go. Dad had taught me never to buckle under pressure. If there was a way to fight back, I'd find it, even if it meant playing at their own game. I realized I needed a plan that was more cunning, something they wouldn't see coming. Because if it was a fight they wanted, they'd pick the wrong old cuss to mess with. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even an expert in business. But I do have a knack for reading people, and one thing I knew for certain. The High Creeks HOA was hungry for expansion, power, and prestige. In their minds, Avery Peak property was a blank canvas for them to paint the region's next big tourist attraction. They wanted to shape the wild mountain into a shiny playground for out-of-towners, complete with overpriced mineral baths and five-star dining. I told myself, if they want a piece of this land so badly, maybe I should let them think they can have it, on my terms and to their ultimate regret. But I had to be careful. These folks could sense a trap if it was laid out plainly, and they would bury me in legal fees if I tried to stop them outright. My best bet was to play coy. So the first thing I did was visit a local attorney, a grizzled man named Julio Perez. He was semi-retired, rumored to have once represented bigwigs in the city. Now he mostly handled modest real estate disputes. Julio liked to wear beyond-the-lookout ties and crocheted vests and always had a piece of peppermint gum in his mouth. He leaned back in his squeaky office chair, flipping through the documents I brought. "Henry," he said. He always called me by my first name, even though I'd introduced myself as Mr. Avery. "The problem is the HOA's claims. They're not just forging documents. They're brazenly stating they have legal rights. If we go to court, it'll cost a small fortune." "That's exactly what they want," I said. "They figure I'll cave when the bills get too big." Julio nodded, releasing a deep sigh. "We can't let them just do as they please. But you have to be 2 steps ahead. You need leverage." Leverage. That single word clung to my mind like a burr. I needed something that would force the HOA to see that messing with the rightful owner was more trouble than it was worth. Driving back from Julio's office, I parked just outside the chain-link fence they'd set up around the construction site and hopped out of my truck. Hard-hatted workers were busy hammering planks onto a log cabin structure, and I noticed a man in a crisp shirt carrying a leather briefcase, walking around and gesturing at workers. He looked like management. I approached him slowly. "Morning," I said, forcing a pleasant tone. "You must be with High Creeks." He turned, regarding me with a polite but guarded smile. "Mike Townsend, site supervisor. Can I help you?" "Well, Mike, I'm Henry Avery, owner of this property." For a second, a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. Then he flashed the same practiced grin I'd seen from so many corporate types. "Mr. Avery, of course. We've heard your name come up. Our attorneys assured us everything was in order." I let a small silence hang in the air, then offered a handshake. "Mighty fine setup you have here. Looks like you're building the Taj Mahal." He laughed, uncertain. "We aim to please. This will be the crowning jewel of the entire High Creeks community." I looked around as though I was impressed. I never realized the land was valuable enough for such a big operation. But I'm not opposed to seeing it thrive under the right conditions. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He obviously wondered why the so-called owner was being so cordial, possibly because they'd expected open hostility. But I wasn't about to bark and stomp my feet. That's the reaction they'd anticipate, and it would only help them label me as a cranky old man standing in the way of progress. Mike shrugged lightly. "Well, the High Creeks Board has big plans for this region. There's talk of an official lodge opening next year, sauna, restaurant, spa, the works." I nodded and pointed to the half-finished foundation near the ridge. "That must be the main building. Ambitious. I'd be curious to see the final blueprint." He gave me a fleeting look, like he wasn't sure if he should share any details, but I put on my best neighborly face. It had helped me rest easier, knowing what's happening on my father's old property. And if it's all above board, well, maybe we can come to an arrangement. He hesitated. Then, perhaps wanting to keep me friendly, he cleared his throat. "We're having an HOA board meeting next Thursday evening. You're welcome to stop by, meet the folks in charge." could be a great chance to discuss your concerns. I smiled, letting my shoulders relax. I think I'll do that. Thank you, Mike. Driving away, I couldn't help but feel a slight rush of satisfaction. The seeds were planted. I needed those folks to believe I was harmless, maybe even open to letting them stay. In the meantime, I'd gather evidence of their wrongdoing. If I could lull them into thinking they were home free, perhaps they'd leave a back door wide open for me to get the upper hand. A few days later, I rummaged through my father's old study. I found stacks of dusty files about Avery Peak going back decades. There was a water rights claim Dad had never cashed in on, plus land survey maps noting a few hidden sinkholes in the area. Those geological quirks might become weapons. No one wants to invest in a spa that might collapse if the land can't be stabilized. I also discovered something else. Dad had once filed a special wildlife preservation agreement with the state. It was never fully processed because the local government had changed leadership, but the application was still valid if resubmitted. If that land was recognized for its rare birds, its migrating fox populations, or any threatened species, it would become nearly impossible for developers to build anything. That gave me an idea. What if I quietly put that old wildlife plan back into motion? If the state recognized Avery Peak as a protected habitat, it would halt the resort's construction and cause the HOA to lose their minds. But the key was to time it just right. See, if I filed it too soon, the HOA would sense my game. They'd bury me in legal challenges before the state could finalize anything. If I waited too late, they might get so far in building that the state might look the other way. I needed them to unknowingly help me gather the very evidence the conservation authorities would need. If they uncovered a rare nest or discovered a hidden spring that provided crucial water for wildlife, that could be the smoking gun. I wanted them to do the legwork, to pay for geological surveys, to compile environmental data, and unknowingly hand me everything I need to slam the door on them. They were going to take the bait, all right, and I was going to be the one reeling them in. On Thursday evening, I showed up to the High Creeks HOA meeting wearing my best collar shirt and a pair of old boots. The gathering took place in a fancy multi-purpose room at their brand-new clubhouse. Polished floors, modern lighting, a refreshments table stocked with tiny eclairs. Inside, about 20 people, mostly in their 50s and 60s, milled about, wearing pastel sweaters or pressed khakis. They looked more like a garden club than a group of real estate sharks. But I knew better. Henry Avery. Mike Townsend called from across the room, urging me over to a circle of chairs where the board members Saturday, glad you made it. One by one, they introduced themselves. Jennifer Moore, the iron-willed HOA president with an unsettlingly perfect smile. Charles Kimball, the property committee head, and a half-dozen others responsible for finances, architectural standards, and so on. We appreciate your attendance, Jennifer said sweetly. We realize you have concerns about our new resort project, but let's begin with the formal agenda, and afterward, we can have an informal chat. I nodded politely. Sure, lead the way. I spent the next hour listening to them discuss everything from pool maintenance schedules to new fines for overgrown lawns. Under different circumstances, I might have found it comedic. These folks took the word meticulous to a whole new level. Eventually, the conversation shifted to the Avery Peak expansion. They displayed slides of the proposed spa lodge and cabins, pointing out how they plan to attract retirees looking for mountain getaways. We came to a Q&A portion. Jennifer turned to me, her expression so polished it might have been carved from marble. So, Mr. Avery, how do you feel about these developments? I paused for effect, letting the room settle. Then I raised my eyebrows. Well, I'll admit at first I was shocked. My father never sold this property, so you can imagine my confusion at seeing the resort springing up. But the more I think about it, the more I realize it could benefit the entire region, if done thoughtfully. Her posture relaxed. I'm happy to hear you say that. Charles Kimball cleared his throat. We do believe we have the proper paperwork on file. However, if there's any question as to the legality, we prefer to handle it amicably. We're prepared to offer a generous compensation package for the final transfer of title. In other words, they wanted me to roll over and give them the deed. I stroked my chin. Well, I'd be open to reviewing any offer. But you'll have to excuse me. I'm old-fashioned. I need to see the details and sleep on it. They nodded, grateful that I wasn't flipping tables. But inside, I was fully aware that once I saw their offer, I'd also get a glimpse of their biggest weaknesses. Over the next few weeks, I had multiple phone calls and meetings with Mike Townsend and even one with Jennifer. They kept sweetening the pot, an upfront payment for the land, plus a small share of future resort revenue. It sounded impressive, but I had no intention of signing. Instead, I asked questions. Lots of them. What kind of environmental surveys have you done? Where will you get your water supply? How will you manage waste? I couched these queries as the concerns of a nostalgic owner who wanted to ensure the property remained pristine. But in reality, I was steering them toward a trap. Each new question prompted them to commission additional studies. They hired a hydrologist to examine the springs, a wildlife expert to document bird species, even a geologist to ensure the foundations were stable. And I insisted that they share the findings with me. After all, how could I agree to a deal without seeing the data? They obliged, hoping to keep me happy and pliable. They spent tens of thousands of dollars collecting reports, which they dutifully sent to my inbox. Meanwhile, I meticulously forwarded those attachments to Julio Perez. We compiled a thick folder of every environmental vulnerability on Avery Peak. Any wildlife, water sources, or fragile terrain that would be protected under state or federal law. Not long after, I decided it was time to set the final stage of my plan in motion. I'd read over the geological survey that indicated there might be an underground aquifer near the waterfall, potentially making the land even more valuable for the spa side of their resort. This was the perfect carrot to dangle in front of them. I invited the HOA board for a little on-site walkthrough, insisting that we discuss any final kinks before finalizing a sale. Of course, I hadn't accepted their offer in writing, but I'd given them just enough hope that they believed I would. They arrived in 3 SUVs one sunny morning, looking slightly out of place against the rugged, pine-laden backdrop. Jennifer wore hiking boots that still sported a fresh price tag. Charles had his pant legs tucked into brand-new gaiters. Mike Townsend held a camera, eager to snap photos of the waterfall, the cabins, and any scenic vantage points they might use for marketing. "We're so excited you're considering our offer, Henry," Jennifer said, adjusting her wide-brimmed sun hat. "I really think this will be beneficial for everyone." I forced my warmest smile. "I think you're right. Let's head on up to the waterfall. You'll love it." We trudged along the winding trail through towering pines, stepping over roots. Despite the short distance, the board members panted like marathon runners. I made sure to lead them the long way around, past the newly dug wells, the half-constructed cabins, and the areas where I knew they'd test for more expansions. I nudged them to take photos, remark on the possibilities, a scenic walkway here, a yoga deck there. They could already visualize dollar signs dancing in their heads. When we finally reached the waterfall, I paused on a rocky ledge. A thin mist sprayed our faces from the cascading water. The entire group oot, and not like they'd discovered Shangri-La. I gestured proudly at the roaring flow. "One of the best features of Avery Peak," I said. "My father always said it was the property's crown jewel." Jennifer beamed. "It's absolutely breathtaking. Imagine the spa packages we could sell." I simply nodded. They were so distracted by this scenic wonder, they didn't notice me checking my watch. It was nearly time for the next crucial step. Little did they know, my hidden allies had arrived, and once they made their move, there'd be no going back. I heard the rumble of an engine before I saw the vehicle. It was a dull, steady clank, an old station wagon crawling up the path. Then, from behind the trees, emerged a small caravan, 2 dusty SUVs carrying state wildlife officials, and trailing behind, the local news van. They parked near the ridge, right by the half-constructed lodge. Jennifer's head snapped around in alarm. Who are they?" I suppressed a smirk. "Let's go find out." We hiked down, the board clearly worried by this sudden intrusion. At the bottom of the hill stood an older man in a ranger's uniform, Stuart Chambers, the state's lead conservation officer. I'd met him weeks earlier after quietly reactivating my father's old preservation application. He stepped forward, giving me a curt nod. "Morning, Mr. Avery," he said, eyeing the group of HOA members. We received word of ongoing construction on land that might fall under new conservation scrutiny. So we're here to investigate potential environmental impacts, pending your formal petition. The color drained from Jennifer's face. Petition? Henry, what is this about? I shrugged, feigning innocence. It's just a standard wildlife preservation process my father started years ago. I figured if we're close to a deal, we should ensure the resort won't harm any protected species. It's only fair, right? Her lips pressed together so tightly I thought they might disappear. Charles blinked rapidly, stepping forward. Now, wait a minute. We have permits for this construction. These expansions are perfectly legal. Stuart Chambers gave him a slow, cool stare. Permits can be overridden if state conservation laws apply. We have reason to believe endangered warblers nest here. And if that's confirmed, this entire area falls under special protections. The camera crew from the local station was already filming. A young reporter bounded out, microphone in hand, capturing the board's panicked expressions. This was exactly the kind of publicity the HOA dreaded, the image of them possibly destroying a protected habitat. Mike Townsend tried to reason with the ranger. We did an environmental study. Nothing indicated warblers. Stuart produced a binder thick with documents. Interesting you mention that. We've seen partial surveys from your own geologist and wildlife consultant. Those surveys mention possible sightings of unusual bird species. That's enough for the state to open an official investigation. I almost chuckled. I'd orchestrated everything perfectly. By leading them to conduct thorough surveys, they had unwittingly supplied the evidence the Conservation Office needed to launch an inquiry. Now, with news cameras rolling, it would become a PR nightmare for the HOA to bulldoze forward. Jennifer whirled on me, frustration etched across her features. Why would you do this, Henry? We've been negotiating in good faith. I met her gaze calmly. Have you really? You built a resort on my land without my consent. Forged or manipulated documents to claim you had the right. Did you think I'd just let that slide? She started to retort, but the reporter, microphone extended, pounced. Ms. Moore, does High Creek's plan to proceed with construction despite potential threats to wildlife? Jennifer glanced at the cameras like a cornered animal. The board members huddled, whispering in frantic tones. Meanwhile, the state officials were already fanning out, speaking with construction workers, snapping photos of the half-constructed buildings. Within minutes, the tension reached a fever pitch. It was clear that if the conservation team found any sign of rare species, or if the local story gained enough traction, the entire project would be shut down. And if the land was legally recognized as critical habitat, the HOA could face massive fines. I let them sweat for a few minutes before stepping aside to place a call to Julio Perez. Stage is set, I said quietly into the phone. He replied that he was ready to file suit if the HOA tried any more nonsense. Finally, Jennifer turned to me, voice trembling but controlled. We need to resolve this, Henry. If we back off, is there a way for us to salvage some portion of this investment? Now, I had them exactly where I wanted them. They were desperate, faced with potential legal doom, public humiliation, and a worthless half-finished resort that might be declared protected zone. I'm open to discussion, I said, my tone measured. But first, we need honesty. Admit that the land belongs to me. Rescind your forged annexation claim. Acknowledge that you built here under false pretenses. Then we'll talk. Charles muttered something under his breath, while Jennifer swallowed hard and nodded. All right, she finally managed. We'll drop our claim. We'll pay for any damages, any legal fees. She glanced at the cameras again. We need to keep this as quiet as possible. I sighed, folding my arms. Keeping it quiet might be tricky with the media here, but I'll see what I can do. Of course, I wasn't going to let them off completely scot-free. They deserve the brunt of public scrutiny. Maybe the coverage wouldn't ruin them altogether, but it would certainly tarnish their pristine reputation. As for the land, I wanted it left alone. Ideally, returned to the same natural state my father had cherished. Over the next few weeks, everything unraveled for the HOA. They halted construction under an emergency injunction. Their board had to meet in private sessions just to figure out how to settle this debacle without bankrupting themselves. Meanwhile, I moved forward with a formal conservation designation for Avery Peak. Once it became official, no large-scale resort could ever be built there again. Legally, the path was winding, but with Julio's help, we hammered out a settlement. High Creeks paid a hefty sum to compensate for trespassing, environmental disruption, and attorney's fees. They also had to remove any structures they'd already erected. Some cabins were partially disassembled, with leftover materials quietly donated to local charities, the only PR-friendly move they had. The rest was bulldozed, the land restored to its natural contours. In the end, I came out of the ordeal with ownership firmly intact, and a new recognition of just how important Avery Peak truly was. A handful of local conservationists banded together to form a stewardship group, and I let them host guided nature walks once a year. We're mindful about preserving the ecosystem while sharing its beauty with the community. And thanks to the board's forced restoration, Avery Peak now has improved trails and fewer invasive species, ironically making it even more pristine. The High Creeks HOA learned a costly lesson. Underestimating an old mountain man with a fierce love for his father's land is a mistake. They took my bait, hook, line, and sinker, and ended up funding their own downfall. One afternoon, as I stood by the waterfall, I couldn't help but think of my father. I imagined him grinning proudly, nodding at the roaring cascade. I never set out to be a trickster or a trap setter, but when push came to shove, I wasn't about to let them turn our family's haven into a corporate playground. That's the funny thing about old, overlooked folks like me. We might not have a fancy legal team, but we've got wits and determination. And sometimes, all it takes is the right bit of bait to topple the whole house of cards. The end.